Well, welcome everyone to the introductory course to cybersecurity. My name is Rich Pethia, and I'm going to be spending the next 20 minutes or so helping you understand some of the issues that I think are important in cybersecurity. And really what I want to focus on in this brief introductory section is answering the question, so what? You've probably all heard in the press, in the media, almost on a daily basis about attacks against our computer systems. Federal budgets in the area of cybersecurity are increasing. There's increasing attention in the private sector about these kinds of issues. And so what's going on? Why is this so important? And what I plan to talk about are some of the key issues that are listed on this first chart. The first one being that our use of communications and information technology has become very pervasive. All of us in government and industry have become very dependent on our information and communication technology. Our information systems are increasingly interconnected and interdependent, and they're vulnerable to attack. The attack technology is outpacing our defensive technology, and the number of attacks and attackers is growing, with attack attribution continuing to be a major challenge. So what I'd like to do is look at each of these issues in a little more detail, and what I'll be bringing to you is basically 24 years of experience that we've acquired here at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon on the CERT program, where we spent those last 24 years working very closely with the broad internet community and other groups on the challenges of information technology and its uses. The dependence on cyber, on what we're calling our cyber ecosystems, has increased dramatically over the past 20 years. If you think about our banking and finance systems, it's quick for most people to realize that those systems, those institutions don't work without heavy use of information and communication technology. But that same technology is now beginning to move into our manufacturing facilities, into our transportation structures, into the oil, natural gas, other energy sectors. If our computer systems no longer work, if they were to be seriously disrupted in some major way, then basically life as we know it begins to disappear. Think about what would happen if the financial systems were down for a 2-week period of time. ATMs don't work, checks don't clear, people can't withdraw funds from their banking institutions. We would literally have chaos in the streets in a very short period of time. Similarly, if we had major power outages in any parts of the country, you can think about the chaos that would be apparent when those kinds of events happened. So one of the key points is this thing called information and communication technology is no longer an option for us. We depend heavily on that technology. Our functions of government and business and academia simply don't work if those systems are unavailable to us. Another thing that's important to consider is really the dramatic growth in the connections that we have between and among our various computer systems and networks. If you all know about the internet, which actually started as the ARPANET back in 1969, and in that time frame there were half a dozen sites depicted on that top map, links between various research computer centers that were used to begin to pull this network together. Since 1969, especially beginning in the 1980s, as the ARPANET transitioned from the ARPANET to the NSFNet and to eventually the Internet, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of systems that are interconnected via that technology. So we've gone from Internet hosts, we had 4 of them in 1969. In 2012, it's estimated that there were over 888 million hosts on the Internet. We've had a dramatic increase in the number of websites. Facebook and other social networking activities are now in heavy use across the globe. And so one of the things that we've done, in addition to being very dependent on our information and communications technology, is we've tied it all together. And because of that, and the fact that we're now looking at a global situation in these networks, we're now sitting at the point where some nefarious character, and that's that little guy at the left-hand side of the slide, can actually sit at any place on this planet and within milliseconds have access to our most critical computer systems. So that combination of dependence and interconnection means that a lot of the security functions that we had in place 20 years ago that really depended on physical segregation of computers, the separation that comes with distances in geography. Those old mechanisms no longer work, and we need to find new and better ways to protect our computer systems in this interconnected world. So what I'd like to do now is spend just a few minutes talking about some of the actual attacks that we've seen over the years and how they've progressed over time to what's become a very serious problem. In the mid-'80s, there was a set of hackers from Germany that were breaking into systems on the West Coast. This is all described in a book called The Cuckoo's Egg, which is published by a fellow named Clifford Stoll, and it outlines a set of attacks that lasted over a one-year period of time, aimed at federal government labs and also federal contractors in the United States. The attacks were coming from Germany. There was a long period of investigation, and eventually arrests were made, and it was discovered that these attacks were coming from a set of hackers who were being allegedly funded by the KGB to steal military secrets and technology from our federal labs and their contractors. That was one of the first cases of real documented espionage across the internet, and it was just the beginning of an ongoing series of activities that carry through today. In 1988, late in 1988, November of that year, on the evening of the 2nd of November, a graduate student at Cornell University tried an experiment where he let loose the first internet worm. Unfortunately, it was coded in a way that allowed it to spread much more quickly and actively than he thought it was going to. The infection eventually spread across thousands of computers on the internet and put so much traffic on the network that it was literally out of commission for about a 2 or 3 day period of time. A number of investigators, researchers, primarily technical people around the country rallied to solve that problem, to reverse engineer the code that was traveling around as a worm, to understand what the problems are, to get patches out to the community. And that was the beginning of incident response on the internet. And so through the late 80s, we continued to see minor kinds of attacks as well as those worms. Early 90s, late 80s, we saw a lot of what I call nuisance activity, vandals, voyeurs, people who were exploring the internet, causing mischief, doing things like jamming email boxes with thousands of messages, or corrupting voicemail recordings, mostly to cause disturbance, sometimes because they were simply curious, trying to understand how the technology works, sometimes because they simply wanted attention. But we saw a raft of that kind of activity in the early 90s. As we moved into the mid-90s, the attacks became a little more serious. And the attack listed on this slide talks about a Russian hacker who accessed Citibank computer accounts and transferred over $10 million of funds out of the Citibank accounts to his own accounts that he used. Did that by using stolen passwords and other passcodes. Citibank and the FBI tracked down the criminal whose name was Levin. He was eventually convicted of a crime, and all but $400,000 of that $10 million was recovered. However, the Citibank suffered a major reputation problem because of that event, and for years they had to work very hard to rebuild their credibility in the community and to reestablish themselves as a trusted banking institution. In 1995, we began to see the beginnings of attacks against major telecommunications companies. MCI, WorldCom, Sprint, AT&T all reported attacks against the phone systems. The attackers, excuse me, the attackers were reprogramming the system so that they had free access to phone lines. They were tapping the home phones of a number of celebrities. They gained information and actually tapped phones that were being operated by the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency. They created their phone numbers for their own use, and this group called the Phone Masters was a major nuisance for a 4 or 5 year period of time. As we moved into the 2000s, again, we saw an escalation in not just the number, but the types of attacks. And so we began to see early use of botnets on the internet. Botnets, these are machines that have been compromised, linked together into a set of attack machines that the attackers control. Typically, there's some kind of command and control infrastructure that's built over top of that collection of computers. And we began to see this phrase here, DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks, in 2000 were aimed against a number of large organizations, Amazon.com, eBay, CNN, and others. And the attacks against those sites lasted for about a 30-minute period of time. Those sites were completely off the air during the time of those attacks. And the only reason that they came back on the air is because the attackers stopped attacking. So we got our first signal from the attacker community that they had a very powerful way to disrupt operations of computer systems, important computer systems on the internet, and in this case, at least, really seriously disrupt commerce, albeit for a short period of time, but it was a marker of signs of things to come. In 2001, we got reports from the FBI that a number of Eastern European hacker groups had stolen information from e-commerce and other online banking sites. Over 40 firms in 20 different states lost over 1 million credit card numbers. The credit card information was sold to organized criminal organizations, and the criminal groups tried to sell various security services to the victim sites. So we also then began to see the beginning signs of extortion on the internet. If you want your systems to continue to run, send us money. And we saw that continue over a significant period of time. And then finally in 2002, we saw more of this attack against businesses and individuals, primarily businesses going after credit card information. The losses in that 1 year total over $1 billion, where once again organized crime groups were working with black hat hackers to steal information from our primary business sites, both here in the States and also in Europe. In 2002 and 2003, we began to see the widespread use of spyware and phishing against individual users. And the point here is that for the first time, the criminals began to understand that by attacking home users, they could get access to valuable information like bank account numbers, PINs, and passwords of one kind. And by going through the individual users of various financial institutions, they could get access to the systems that really held the money that they were after. So spyware became widely and freely available. It was distributed via email, very often bogus email messages that would cause people to click on a link that would allow the malware to be installed on their machines. That malware would install keystroke loggers that captured all the information that the users were typing, and by doing so, they were able to capture the account name and passwords for very valuable information. That continued into 2003 as phishing became a very active activity on the internet. The growth in phishing has continued from that time to grow by 15, 20, 30, 40% per month. Certain periods of time, like over the holidays, we see big spikes in that activity. And if you go out and visit the Anti-Phishing Working Group's website, you can find a number of important current statistics on just the level and the extent of activity and how much damage is being done on a regular basis. Identity theft is something that we began to see in 2004-2005 timeframe. And during that time frame, the bad guys also discovered that university sites were very easy targets for their kinds of attacks. Very often, back in those days, university sites were not well protected. They were designed to be open so that students, faculty, staff, organizations in the neighborhood would have free and easy access to the university's computer systems, but unfortunately, that free and easy access often extended into the administrative systems of the universities where important information about students, like their social security numbers, dates of birth, and what have you, were stored. So in 2005, we saw a series of reports of attacks against university systems where information was lifted out that would cause people to begin to suffer problems with identity theft, people using information to basically compromise individuals' identity, get the information from their accounts, establish contracts in their names, and cause a lot of havoc. Also at that time, we began to see those kinds of attacks aimed at late 2005 organizations like ChoicePoint, where tens of thousands of identities could be stolen in a very short period of time. The other significant activity that I think occurred in the 2005 timeframe is one that I'm especially concerned about, and it continues today, and that's the beginnings of what I call the cyber mercenaries and the underground computer activity. In 2005, you had an option if you wanted to create a botnet. You could build it, but to do that, you had to have a lot of expertise and knowledge and understand how to do that. Or you could buy one. You could go to number one of these underground groups and simply pay them money. And you have now your own botnet that you can use to do whatever you want. Or if you're really cheap, you can actually rent one. And the going rate back in 2005 was about $100 an hour to rent a botnet to do whatever you wanted to do, distribute illicit email, launch various kinds of attacks, go fishing over the internet. All of that was available to you on a part-time basis as you rented these kinds of technology. And it was really the beginning of what today is a very big and flourishing underground organization where anyone can buy attack technology. They can buy the services of these cyber mercenaries. They can contract with people to do attacks, very sophisticated attacks against any kind of a target. And often we're seeing today that these cyber mercenaries are contracting not just with criminal groups, but also with nation states to achieve espionage attacks against the U.S. and other European countries. We also began to see the prominent development of what are called web mobs. Back then, in 2005, they had names like Carter Planet, Stealth Division, Dark Prophets, Shadow Crew, but these were organizations that helped build the underground. They had strong management structures. They had specialization of activities. They had people who would go out and harvest credit cards. They had wholesalers who would pull bulk groups of credit cards together and wholesale them out to other distributors who would break them down, qualify them, and sell them out on a retail basis. Often for less than $10 a card, you could buy a credit card that was validated to be current and accurate. And so this turned into a huge industry, which is still operating today, causing a number of law enforcement organizations major grief as they try to shut down that kind of fraudulent activity. You've all probably read the press recently where the phrase cyber war is becoming more and more prominent. Back in 2007, 2010, there was a period for about 2 months in 2007 where, as a Pentagon official said, an amazing amount of data was exfiltrated from an unspecified number of Pentagon computers. This attack was reported in a number of federal publications back in 2010. And it was a significant attack against our government systems. Similarly, in 2008, there was an attack against a major defense contractor where terabytes of data related to the design and electronics of the Joint Strike Fighter were exfiltrated to some site. And so, again, a serious case of espionage aimed at the U.S. and its defense industrial base. And in fact, in 2010, Mike McConnell, who was President Bush's director of national intelligence, actually made the statement that cyber war is not something that's going to happen in the future. It's something that's happening now. The United States, as he said, is fighting a cyber war today, and we are losing. It's that simple. And that activity, kind of activity, continues into today. You've probably recently seen reports in the Washington Post, the New York Times, that the White House has leaked information that the virus that was known as Stuxnet, the botnet known as Stuxnet, was actually the work of the federal government here in the United States. Stuxnet is probably one of the most significant pieces of attack technologies that I've seen in the 20 years that I've been doing this. It's a botnet like many others. It's a large, complex piece of malware. It spreads around the internet. It's looking for signs of systems that have something to do with code that is used in the Siemens programmable logic controllers. So as As the malware enters various systems, it looks for signs of any kind of code that has the right code sequences that would indicate that this code is targeted to one of those machines. It was propagated over the internet. It was targeting systems primarily in Iran. And in fact, it's the first piece of malware that I know of that successfully jumped an air gap between the internet and a disconnected control machine. So basically the machine looked for a machine that would eventually be used to create software which would then be put onto a thumb drive or a CD or some other removable device and then hand carried to the standalone isolated system that was operating the industrial control machinery that was used to enrich uranium. And once it was planted on that standalone control system, it modified the way the centrifuges worked so that, in fact, the centrifuges appeared to be working, but were operating so erratically at different speeds that the uranium production activity was worthless. And according to the reports in the press, it's set back Iran's nuclear program by at least a year. So this is the first time that we've seen a real sophisticated piece of attack technology launched over the internet that found its way into a disconnected system on the internet and caused serious damage. Also, more recently, we've seen a number of attacks against Sony, against the Department of Commerce, against large global payment systems. And so we continue to see all of the things that I've talked about over the last few minutes. It's not that they came and then went. They came and continued. And year after year after year, we continue to see an increase in this kind of attack and attack technology. Most recently, and I would encourage you to go visit the Verizon website, Verizon risk team, along with the Australian Federal Police, the Dutch National Police, an Irish organization, and the United States Secret Service just published within the last couple of weeks their annual survey, they call a data breach report. It discussed over 174 million compromised records that were reported, and you can see here that most of the attacks were coming from outside of the organizations that were attacked. 81% involved some form of hacking. 96% were not highly difficult. 85% of the breaches took over 2 weeks to discover, so a lot of these attacks go undetected for long periods of time. 92% of those breaches were discovered by third parties, and 97%, and this is very important, and it's why I think this course that you're taking is important, 97% of those breaches could have been avoided through the use of simple and intermediate level controls in the technology and the use of that technology. So this thing called computer security, cybersecurity, is something that we all need to pay attention to. The other point that I wanted to make is over the years we've charted the sophistication of cyber attacks. And over the years, as you go from the bottom left-hand corner of this chart to the right top, the attacks have become more and more and more sophisticated. So the attack technology that the bad guys are using is basically put us in an arm race with the people who are creating defensive technologies running the race against the people who are creating the attack technologies, and the attackers often have the advantage. Attackers only have to find one vulnerability to break into a system. Unfortunately, those of us who are trying to protect systems have to find them all. And so that gives a natural advantage to the attacker. The attackers now know that, and they're taking advantage of it. The other thing to take note of is that little curve that's on the chart that goes from the upper left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner, and that's the average level of technical sophistication the attacker actually has to have, and that's to indicate the power of the attack technology. So as I said earlier, there are cyber mercenaries who are out there who will attack systems, but they will also create tools for you, the naive user, the novice user, and those tools allow you, the novice user, to be very successful at attacks. And the outshot of that means that the attacker population is going to increase and is increasing dramatically. You no longer have to be a technical expert to successfully attack systems. You simply have to have access to the attack tools which are now widely available on the internet. So some lessons that we've learned over these last years, I think one of the biggest is that change is the one thing that's constant. We have a number of complex, dynamic, and evolving cyber systems, and a lot of the behavior that we see from those systems is unexpected. Our systems have become so large and complicated that it's very difficult to understand where all the vulnerabilities are and how we're going to deal with them. We are going to continue to see ongoing growth in users, connections, dependence, and interdependence. And you think for a while and you say, well, someday this has to end. Pretty soon everybody on the planet's going to have a system. Well, actually everybody on the planet's going to have 8 or 10 systems, because we're now beginning to carry our smartphones, our iPads, our various tablet devices, and soon we'll see intelligence being put into things like automobiles that are available for everyday use, and all kinds of other devices will be rushing to the internet. The new smart grid is based on basically internet technology, and we will be seeing houses connected to all kinds of devices, initially to help them receive the more efficient and more cost-effective ways to deliver power and electricity. But over time, you can imagine all kinds of connections that will be happening over those networks, and that means more and more devices interconnected on the internet. Unfortunately, new vulnerabilities are found routinely. Our practices at developing technology, software especially, have not improved all that much over the last 20 years. And if you think about the explosion in the generation of things like apps for your iPhone and your iPad, think about all those tens of thousands of people creating code for our portable computing devices who really have no background at all in software engineering or understand what some of these vulnerabilities are or how to deal with them. So the problem from that perspective is going to be quite challenging for some time to come. A lot of the software products that we use today are of unknown or questionable provenance, so we don't really understand where all the bits and pieces have come from. We have very long and deep supply chains, and it's not clear when you buy a product exactly where that technology was developed or how it was developed or what steps were taken to ensure that it's secure against any kind of attack, or that nothing was intentionally planted in that technology that the bad guys may come and eventually use. And our experience says each new generation of vendors that comes onto the scene seems to have to learn the security lesson the hard way. And so we spend a lot of time working with people who are bringing new products to the internet who simply don't understand what the threat picture looks like or how to defend against it. The global and ubiquitous internet connected systems are really changing the fabric of government, business, and citizen interactions. New threats are emerging on a regular basis. There's a report that was just recently released this past week from the defense community that discusses espionage, industrial espionage against U.S. sites. It's at dramatic levels. If you're an emerging economy, if you're an emerging country, if you think technology is important and that you ought to have high technology being used in your country or be able to become a producer of these devices, you have a choice. You can invest in the research and development that's needed to develop that technology, or you can go steal it. And today, the choice of many of these countries is to go steal it. And a lot of it's being stolen from U.S. firms and U.S. government. As I said before, the adversary tradecraft is becoming more sophisticated, and the adversaries are determined and quickly adapt to our new defenses. So we're going to continue to see this arms race that I talked about into the future, where we, the good guys, are going to have to pay constant attention to the security problem. And so we need security solutions that continuously evolve and scale to meet new challenges. I think we're going to see, and we already see, increasing dissatisfaction with the effectiveness of things like blacklisting approaches, basically where machines are prohibited from accessing websites or other internet hosts that are known to be in some way malicious. The problem with blacklisting approaches is that it's an always growing and never-ending list, and you simply can't keep track of them all. So many organizations are switching to a philosophy of what's called whitelisting, where people within an organization can only access machines that have somehow been proven to be credible. A much more manageable approach to that kind of a problem. There's growing dissatisfaction with intrusion detection systems, with their limited effectiveness and inability to scale to ultra large-scale systems. So there are whole new classes of technology that are being developed to deal with that class of problem. But the last thing I want to leave you with is really an understanding that the basics will always be important, that there are things that you can do, that if you do those things, as we saw on the earlier chart that reported the results of the Verizon work, that over 95, 97% of the problems that you see can be dealt with using those basic things like configuration management, account management, awareness training, continuing monitor and analysis of the network traffic coming into your systems. So in conclusion, we are going to continue to see sustained exponential increase in our computing capabilities in our networks. It's unprecedented, but it's going to continue, and it's going to continue decade after decade after decade. Every day, we're going to have the opportunity to discover the new and finally visible properties and capabilities of cyberspace, and I'm sure that with all the entrepreneurial folks that we have, we'll find ways to capitalize on those things to extend our economy, to improve our productivity. And so I don't mean to imply with all these problems with the internet that it's a bad thing, but it's a thing that we have to manage. So every day we're also going to have to address new cybersecurity issues that are new or that were latent and not discovered until the current period of time and are finally serious enough to matter. So all of us have a role to play. We each need to understand what steps we can take as individuals within our homes, within our organizations that we work for. What's the role that we have? What responsibilities do we have? And what steps can we take to protect our critical assets? And I hope you take advantage of the rest of this course to build your basic understanding of the problems and the solutions. So with that, I'll conclude. Hope you have a good time in the rest of the course. And I'm sure that this is something that hopefully will catch your attention and something you'll pay attention to for years to come. Thanks.
Okay, lots of great questions coming in from Rich from our audience. So we'll get right to them. I know we're running a little tight. So first question is from Tom asking, what is the CERT of the future? How will CERT define success with the way things change so rapidly?
I suspect there's going to be many futures, not just one. So as I said earlier, this is an ever-evolving problem. And for us, there are three dimensions of it that are very important. And I'm going to make it real simple, say we're interested in influencing the world to create better product, influencing system operators to create better process, and to support all of that, we need a better cybersecurity workforce. So we're going to continue to work in all three of those areas, helping people who acquire and develop systems understand what practices, processes, techniques, and tools are effective at building stronger foundations in the technology that we use for the base of our communication and information technology. We're going to continue to work with organizations who operate and sustain systems to help them understand what kind of technologies and practices are needed to reduce risk and manage it over time. And then finally, a significant emphasis on workforce development.
Okay, great. Deepak would like to know, commercial software developers are more motivated to produce something right away than something right and secure. What factors will change this situation?
What we've seen over time is that as the vendors get more mature, they really do come to an understanding that security pays off not just for the customers but for them. And so when you think about the costs that a software vendor incurs every time they have to update software to correct a problem of any sort, especially a security problem, that long-term maintenance cost gets to be pretty expensive. So for companies that have been in the internet space for a number of years, they all have very active quality assurance programs to help ensure that the software they put out the door isn't riddled with bugs, and they certainly have very active vulnerability management processes to ensure that once vulnerabilities are discovered, they're more quickly mitigated. The difficulty I think we're going to continue to have is that as new vendors come into the space, we're going to continue to see them come up this learning curve. As I said earlier, each generation of vendors seems to have to learn these lessons the hard way, and that's we're going to continue to work with those new organizations as they come online to get them up that learning curve as fast as we can.
Okay, great. Michael would like to know, what are your thoughts on TLD blacklisting, meaning top-level domain?
Certainly it's something that could be done to help you deal with problems, but in general, I'm not a fan of blacklisting of any kind. I think it puts you in a situation where you're constantly trying to keep up with an ever-changing problem that's growing. The blacklists continue to get longer and longer, and I'd much rather see people tighten down their systems to the point where they're only accessing things they really need to get to, rather than blocking out big chunks of the internet.
Okay, great. Eric wants to know, you alluded to an oft-repeated meme that attackers only have to find a single vulnerability to exploit, whereas defenders have to find them all. Do you believe this is still true in light of applications of security control layering, whitelisting, and Emmet?
Unfortunately, it is still true. All of those things that he described there are things that help narrow the gap, reduce the vulnerability space, but still, the attackers who are persistent and who have strong technical skills will find ways around those controls.
Okay, can we squeeze in 3 more? Now, I know we got to move on to Robert Secord. More of a comment from Donald, but is there light at the end of the tunnel?
This is not going to be a sprint that ends anytime soon. I think we all need to understand that this problem is going to continue to be with us for years to come, especially with our appetite for new technology. And as we bring that new technology into our systems and incorporate it, that's going to open up new vulnerabilities. So I think we can make things better. I think we can give the operators more of a fighting chance to deal with those problems, but the problems aren't going to disappear. It's like managing any other kind of risk. We still have to worry about hurricanes, we still have to worry about tornadoes, and we're still going to have to worry about hackers 5 years from now.
Okay, and we'll end with Mark asking, regarding the cyber arms race and protecting intellectual property, is the government report references unclassified and available for review?
Everything that I've mentioned is available. I would encourage people to go out and look in the government space. A lot of good studies that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years, and they're available to the public.
Great. Rich, thank you very much for taking the time and the extra time. And that's it. Thanks again.
Thanks.